Welcome, everybody. My name is Mina Jane, and I'm the director of the Ashland Public Library in Massachusetts. And I'm very excited to be here with Judith Lindbergh, who's going to be talking about her book, Akmaral, which is a fascinating talk about, well, you'll see, nomadic warrior women. And I want to get that right because it's just fascinating. And I want to know where she got her ideas from. I want to know all of it. But before we get to Judith, I just want to say thanks to the Friends of the Ashland Public Library for supporting all of our programs. We couldn't do it without them. And I'd also like to thank Judith for letting us share this program with other libraries who hopped onto it. They wanted to help promote it and share it with their communities. And, when libraries work together, we just, make magic. Um, you can buy signed books by Judith from Aesop's Fable, our very favorite local indie bookstore. And I will send an email to everybody with that information so you can order books if you would like to, or of course you can find them from your local libraries. If you have questions for Judith, you can put them in the Q&A, which is a button at the bottom of your screen, your Zoom screen, and I'll be moderating those after her slides. She's going to do a 40-minute presentation, and then we're going to have about 15-20 minutes for Q&A. So make sure you put your questions in that Q&A button. I will be turning the chat off during her slides just so it's not distracting, and so you can just totally pay attention to her. So Judith, this is like so funny. Her book, Akmaral. Okay, let me start with this. Judith's mother lives in Ashland, Massachusetts, where my library is.
Hi, Mom.
And, and I'm pretty sure she gave us the book, Akmaral. And one day she was walking through the library and there it was on one of our shelves. And she just came running over to my office and was like, "Oh my gosh, did you know my daughter Judith wrote this book?" And I was just like, "Really?" And she's like, "Yes, and I live in Ashland and I want you to do a talk with her." And I was just like, "Absolutely." So I reached out to Judith and within a day we had something planned because
Mhm.
Judith is awesome. So
Oh,
her book, Akmaral, is, like I said, about nomadic warrior women in the ancient Central Asian steppe. That's all I'm going to tell you because I want to hear it from Judith. Judith, welcome. So I'm so glad you're here tonight.
thank you so much, Mina, and thank you to the Ashland Library and all the other libraries out there who shared my book and my work. And thank you, Mom. I love you very much. I know you're on the call somewhere. And I also saw a chat that my friend Kathy, way down in South Florida, is here. So hi, Kathy. I love you. So Akmaral is a work of my heart, and it took a long, long time to write. And I'm going to tell you just a little bit of the tip of this very deep iceberg of research that went into this book. But I also want to say that it was written to be a story of a really human story. So, with all the weird archaeology that I'm about to show you, get ready. That's not what the book comes across as. But in order to write a book like this, you have to dive really deep. So,
Mhm.
here we go.
So before you get started, Judith, with your slides, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself since I did such a lame bio?
Oh, I grew up in Worcester. And I am my first novel, The Thrall's Tale, was about three women in the first Viking Age settlement in Greenland,
Mhm.
and it was published quite a long time ago by Viking. And then I also have written many, many articles and essays for various publications, personal essays, essays about archaeology, ancient history, a lot of things about obscure places and difficult lives, because that is really what fascinates me. I also run a creative writing community it's centered in New Jersey, but we do lots of things online. It's called the Writers Circle. And I teach a ton of students from ages 8 to over 80. Quite literally, on Saturdays, I'm sitting on the floor with the third to fifth graders, and the rest of the week, I'm like acting like a normal adult.
Awesome.
But everything I do is about writing
Mhm.
these days. All right.
Well, it definitely came out in Akmaral, so I can't wait to hear about it. I'm going to go off screen and I'll come back when we get to the Q&A.
Okay. All right. So I am going to share my screen. And I'm going to just start with this little introduction. Akmaral is about a nomad woman warrior on the ancient Central Asian steppes who must make peace with making war. That's the log line. But the roots of Akmaral come from not a fantastical reality. She is actually a literal physical piece of history. Akmaral is descended from the Amazons, the same women warriors who fought in the Trojan War and battled heroes like Heracles, Theseus, and Achilles. And she knows from earliest childhood that she is destined to be a warrior, as all her people must. According to the ancient Greek historian Herodotus, the Amazons' custom was that no maiden weds until she has killed in battle, and some grow old and die unmarried because they cannot satisfy this need. This is from Herodotus, the Histories, Book 4, and Herodotus is one of the only contemporary documentary evidence that I had to work with when I was writing Akmaral. Most historical novelists rely on documents and letters and so on and so forth, but this is so far back in history that this is pretty much all I had. Luckily, Herodotus was not what got me started on this journey. It was archaeology, as you're going to see in the pictures that I'm going to be showing you in the presentation. But first, I want you to just take a look at this extraordinary, breathtaking landscape. This is the Altai Mountains in Central Asia, where Akmaral's story begins 2,500 years ago. And I'm going to read you a brief passage about this place. The steppes are not a lonely place. They are vast, filled with spirits that linger and nourish. They take the form of eagles and antelope, hill pigeons that flock, black choughs that inhabit the winds. Foxes roam the flatlands and rabbits tuck into the narrow places. They tickle alive the broad, verdant grasses and the shallow, fragrant valleys. If you watch closely and listen, you will learn from them. Still, it is not a human place. If ready companionship is what you seek, you must go to the settled villages. These dapple the shores of rivers, the sheltered sides of hills, the confluences of roads made by hoofprint of goats and sheep, horses and camels. Our people sometimes visited these villages, for they had fine things to trade. We showed them rolls of felts, or crafted rugs, or dried meats, or cheese, and they gave us glistening beads of stone or glass formed in places we had never heard of, or bolts of nubbly silk, or wrought gold plaques like those my dead mother once knew how to cast, or tools or blades of bronze, and sometimes even iron, like my father's. Sometimes we stood at a distance, watching the strangers who roamed the endless byways, impatient merchants coaxing their caravans, small dots like a trail of ants traipsing to each horizon. They were vulnerable and anxious for a place, forever heading somewhere, while we herders were at home wherever we stayed. So here is a map of the Central Asian steppes in the 5th century BC. And you see the colored areas show the full range of what is called the Scythian area of influence. And I can get super nerdy, so I'm going to really try hard not to. But they go all the way in the west in the Ukraine, where unfortunately we are all rather familiar these days, all the way across the Russian steppes to the Altai Mountains right here, which are at the convergence of Mongolia and Kazakhstan, China to the south, and up here, Siberia. In fact, the place is called Tuva. It's a state in southern Siberia. Here is a modern map with some borders to help you get your bearings. And you'll see this pin right here in southern Siberia, something really extraordinary was found there that I'll be telling you about that has a lot to do with how Akmaral was born. But first, how did the ancient Amazons from the Trojan War, which was fought all the way over here south of Istanbul, get to the middle of nowhere in Central Asia? This is about 3,300 miles away. I'm going to tell you the story. According to Herodotus, after the Trojan War, the defeated Amazon women were shipped home across the Black Sea. They hijacked the ship, as Amazon women would, and threw all the men overboard. But apparently they didn't know how to sail, so they drifted for a while until they crash landed on the cliffs of Lake Maeotis, which is the modern-day Crimean Peninsula. There they captured some wild horses and rode off across the steppes, only to be stopped by a band of Scythian warriors. Now, the Scythians were determined to fight until they realized that their enemies were women. As so often happens in these ancient Greek tales, the battle turned to courtship, and before long, the two bands were living rather happily together. So while the Scythians wanted to stay with their fantastic Amazon lovers, the Amazons refused to live the way the Scythian women did, without the freedom to hunt, battle, and roam at will. So they agreed to ride off together to the east, and they became a new tribe called the Sauromatae, and that is the name I adopted for my characters of people. Herodotus provides the origin story for my characters. But let me show you what really got me started writing Akmaral. This is a kurgan mound. It's a large burial chamber made by people. It's one of countless mounds like it that are dotting the entire Central Asian steppes throughout this so-called Scythian area of influence. Now, the next slide is a mummy. So if you're grossed out by stuff like that, feel free to, close your eyes. But I think it's really cool. Please don't, because I think it's amazing. This is the tomb of the Siberian ice maiden. She was discovered in that little dot of red in that map in 1995 near a village called Pazyryk in the high mountain plateau of southern Siberia. And her body was so well preserved by the permafrost that even her skin survived, including the intricate animal-style tattoos that line her arms, as you see here. And at the top of her left shoulder is the iconic flying deer image, which also now is on the cover of my novel. Thank you to my publisher. So this deer symbol became a very important part of the mythology and the belief systems that I created for Akmaral, and it becomes a symbol also for her character. Now, I'm no longer looking at mummies, anyone who was grossed out by that. Here's a sketch of the tattoo, which I think is absolutely beautiful. And you'll see it's not just a regular, ordinary deer. It is actually kind of a mythical deer in this strange, twisted position. And the antlers are topped with these kind of floral-looking things. The archaeologists think that they are griffins, which gives this deer image a mystical and mythical quality that connects these people who live on the earth with their ancestors and the spirits. Here's a modern interpretation of that very same tattoo. And on one of my early book events, and it was a Zoom call, this woman who I didn't know was on the call. And at the end of it, she's like, "Can I show you something?" And she lifted up her shoulder, and she had exactly the same tattoo on her shoulder, and she was from Kazakhstan. So that's a very big deal in this part of the world, even to this day. So this is a reconstruction of the Pazyryk or Siberian ice maiden's burial. She was laid to rest with an a huge feast of horse meat and fermented mare's milk. She had grave goods of gold and bronze, and 6 horses were sacrificed in her honor. So if you think about a horse sort of as a Tesla or another really expensive car, you kind of get a sense of how massive this sacrifice was, and that signifies how important this woman must have been to her people. Now, her coffin, and this is it, was made of larch wood. And you'll notice that it is located where it was found in a valley that has no trees. So you have to wonder what they had to do to get these gigantic logs up there. And it's 8 feet long in order to accommodate the Siberian Ice Maiden's headdress, which is reconstructed here. And this ornate headdress was made up of felts and also these beautiful gold objects. One more interesting thing about the Siberian Ice Maiden, because her body was so well preserved, the scholars were able to test her DNA. And they discovered that she was actually of Caucasian origin, meaning essentially she was a European buried in the middle of Central Asia. And that fact alone connects her directly to the ancient Greek stories of the Amazons. Here is a reconstruction of what she would have looked like at the time of her death when she was barely 30 years old. And you see she has the tattoo on her shoulder. Now, I found this initial burial so extraordinary. It just made me ask myself, well, who was this woman and why was she buried there? And what do all these objects mean? And what was her culture? And I just kind of do what I do and went deep into discovering more. And along the way, I found another fascinating burial. This is the Izhik Golden Man, who was found in Kazakhstan in the 1960s. And as you see, this person was laid to rest, covered in a vest made of tiny arrow-shaped gold plaques. And they were also buried with a dagger and a sword. Now, this is back in the 60s, and they didn't have DNA testing. And the scholars and the archaeologists looked at the remains, and they said, well, he's got weapons, so he's got to be a guy. Luckily, more modern scholars returned and looked at the artifacts a little bit more closely and with a slightly different perspective. And the stature of the burial, some of the other artifacts and objects that were found with it, and particularly this tall, ornate headdress, which isn't exactly the same, but quite similar to the Siberian Ice Maidens. But even more interestingly, it's exactly the same style of headdress that modern brides in Kazakhstan wear on their wedding days, even to this day. And I have authenticated this with some of the Kazakh people that I've met along the way. So this is like, clearly to them, this is a woman. And it turns out that this burial is the kind of national symbol of Kazakhstan. And the people there no longer call it the Izhik Golden Man. They call it the Izhik Golden Warrior, to acknowledge that it is almost certainly a woman. They didn't have enough DNA to test, and we'll never know for sure, but the two burials together, along with what I discovered were countless burials that have since been found of women warriors in this region, women who were killed in battle, whose bodies showed the injuries they received in battle before their deaths. They were buried with arrowheads, spear tips, daggers, swords, all the weapons of war. And I took these burials and these evidences of women in this ancient setting, and I created a character, Akmaral, who is a young warrior who will eventually become, like the Ice Maiden, a leader to her people. But first, Akmaral must become proficient at warfare. And as you see in this video of a modern-day Mongolian woman, being on horseback with a bow and arrow gave women the equal footing on the battlefield as men. And these skills are still practiced by both men and women to this day in the region. Um, the other thing you have to consider, this modern woman, you can't see it very well here, but she has stirrups on her saddle. And that gives her great anchorage and she makes it easier for her to do what she just did. But Akmaral's time was several hundred years prior to the development of stirrups. So people in the ancient times had to do that in battle by holding onto their horse with the sheer strength that was in their legs and thighs. I have one more burial thing that I'm going to show you. These two skeletons are from the Scythian era, and you see that they are laid to rest in the position of a mounted warrior. And not only that, if you look very closely, their thighs are slightly bowed, their thigh bones, from spending a lifetime in the saddle. Now you'll see under the left shoulder, interesting, same shoulder as the tattoo on the other, there is this round greenish object with a handle. That is a bronze mirror, and it is believed to be a symbol of spiritual power and something that might have been used to summon the ancestors and the gods by the shamans of that time. And in this next slide is another bronze mirror from the period that has the same flying deer design all the way around. So this particular mirror is the one that I gave to one of the characters in my novel, a shamaness, and I'll be talking about her in a moment. Now, here are some modern photos of people in the region who are still living or practicing some of the traditions of these ancient nomadic peoples to this day. And actually, if you know Genghis Khan and the Mongols in the 12th and 13th hundreds, they are descendants of the characters in my novel and the cultures of my novel. This little girl is part of a nomadic band, and they put their kids on horseback even before they can walk because riding is a required necessity of their daily lives. There's every summer they have in Central Asia this huge festival called the Nadam Festival, where people from all around the region get together for horseback racing, archery, wrestling, music, and they continue these traditions. It's sort of like the Central Asian Olympics. And this little girl at the top, you'll notice she has blonde hair. Back to the Siberian Ice Maiden, when they tested the DNA, they also tested this little girl's DNA and compared it to see if there was a genetic link. And in fact, in some really distant way, this child is a great, 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 great grandchild of the Siberian Ice Maiden. So there's still people in that region who are related to that person thousands of years later. To understand my characters, I had to do more than read a lot of archaeological studies, which I did. I actually had to understand what it was like to be a woman in this time and place. And I take my research really to as far as I can. So I went out horseback riding quite a lot, not as much as to be really skillful, but I was out there as much as I could to feel what it was like to be Akmaral on the horse. And I also used to practice archery. And again, I'm really bad. And I would set up so in my kids were little and they had just outgrown their toddler bed. And we had this old color red play school slide in the backyard. So I'd put the slide in the backyard, turn it backwards so the steps were toward me, take the toddler bed and use it as a target practice and lean it against the slide. And I would stand on my deck with this very simple bow and arrows, really, none of the wheels and pulleys of a modern compound bow, just a simple thing. And I would practice. And I learned why you need to protect your arms because the string will snap against your hand. And I would practice and I would miss. And I tended to shoot high. So I go over the top of the slide and onto the grass behind. And I go over the slide and into the garden behind. And then one day I shot a hole through my neighbor's fence. And That's the hole. It's still there. It's cold out, but I could still see it. And thankfully, my neighbor did not kill me. It was brand new at the time. But that's kind of the end of the practicing archery in the backyard. But I really learned a little bit more about the dangers of shooting in your backyard or shooting in general for Akmaral's sake. Back to Akmaral. She becomes so proficient at her battle skills that she draws the attention of another warrior of their clan, the troubled, hostile young Erzhan, who is a male warrior. This is, many generations after the Amazons, and there are men around. And this young man envies Akmaral as much as he desires her. So while she is grappling with his unwanted attentions, another tribe attacks. This is a rogue band of Scythians who hail from far to the west in what is today the steppes of the Ukraine and Russia. She and Erzhan must band together with the rest of their clan to defeat these strangers. And they take 3 as captives, including the group's leader, Timor, whose penetrating blue eyes and steadfast resolve, even as he is brutalized and enslaved, draw Akmaral in and lead her toward her destiny. Speaking of destiny, Akmaral wears an amulet as a symbol of her destiny, as foretold by the mysterious shamaness, the Karakam or black shamaness, at the very beginning of the book. This is the image that I use to imagine the deer amulet that she wears. And the Karakam is the woman who has that mirror that I showed you earlier. Now she lives at the outskirts of the tribe, and is shunned and feared by all of them. And her yurt, her home, is covered in white felts. In black felts, while everyone else is covered in white. Meanwhile, there's an Akkam. Ak means white, so the white shamaness serves the clan as their sanctioned priestess and spiritual leader. So there's an interesting tension between these two characters who are deeply connected to the tribe and the spirit world. And the connection also ties into Akmaral's destiny. Here are 2 modern-day shamanesses. Shamanism is a practice that is still used and believed in today in Central Asia, although during the Soviet era it went underground, as you can imagine. But in shamanism, the practitioner enters the spirit world and provokes altered states of consciousness in order to heal, to predict the future, and aid those in the physical world. You'll see this woman on the left is from the Siberian state of Tuva, and she has this round, flat drum that I borrowed for my characters. Not that one, but I imagined it. And here a woman in Mongolia is tossing fermented mare's milk, which is called kumis, or arag. In my book, it's kumis. And that she tosses in all the cardinal directions as a sacrifice and blessing. And I borrowed that ritual for my characters as well. And this is Soyun. The time the pictures were taken, she was about 100 years old, and she was a shamaness traveling with a nomadic reindeer band in the northern Mongolian and Tuvan steppes. And I think she was one of the first images of shamanesses from the region that I saw, and I just found her face absolutely fascinating and a little bit frightening, and just everything about her just told me that I needed to incorporate her into my story. So my Karakam, the black shamaness, is named Soyun after this character, this woman. Now, going back to the captive leader, Timor. He's an outsider, and he introduces a vastly different perspective about the role of women into Akmaral's matriarchal tribe. He challenges Akmaral's implicit sense of power and equality, she's never even given two thoughts to the fact that she's an equal. And all of a sudden, this guy comes in and treats her and other women quite differently. And at the same time, Timor is desperately trying to reclaim his own masculinity in this tribe where he is considered a slave. But slowly, through his relationship with Akmaral, he becomes more integrated into the tribe. This is a felt that's part of the many artifacts from the region, and it has a woman on a throne with this kind of branch-like floral scepter, and a man is coming to greet her on horseback. And I use this also as a sort of destiny, an image that I wanted to portray Akmaral's where she's going in her life. This is the part of the novel where there's an important transition from matriarchy to patriarchy, which is actually evidenced in the archaeology, which I won't get into the details, but it's actually right there. You can see it, how things change at a certain period of time. And the story brings into focus the power struggle, not only between male and female, but between Timor, the slave, and Erzhan, the warrior. At the beginning, they're enemies, but eventually they become allies as they recognize their struggle against the clan's matriarchal tribal rule. So Akmaral, Timor, and Erzhan form a deep, complicated triangle of relationship that is at the heart of my novel. Timor also introduces an unfamiliar practices to Akmaral's clan, including eagle hunting, which is still practiced on the Central Asian steppes today, in particular in eastern Kazakhstan. And this is a Kazakh hunter with his gigantic golden eagle, which he has raised from an eaglet and uses for hunting. And if anyone remembers, a few years back, there was a documentary called The Eagle Huntress, which was a contemporary documentary about a little girl in Kazakhstan who wanted to hunt with eagles and was told, no, you're a girl. So these traditions and struggles continue to this day. It's a good movie. You should watch it. So golden eagles are huge, with wingspans of over 8 feet. And they have been known to prey on very large animals, including deer and wolves. And you can see here, I'm not making this up. So if you can imagine when Timor, the slave, comes in to the tribe with an eagle on his arm, this is not just a pet or a tool. This is a threat. This animal is a weapon. And that creates some interesting tensions in the tribe as well. Animals are critical to Akmaral's people. They're the source of everything they need to survive, from food to transportation, clothing, shelter, and they also are deeply connected to the people's spiritual beliefs, as evidenced by these plaques that were found in the burials. The spiritual beliefs are deeply connected to earth, nature, and the predators that represent both the beauty and the savagery of survival in the steppes. In these images, we have several different kinds of animals. These are created in what's called the Scythian animal style. It's unique to this culture and this huge region, but from that time. We have 2 kind of coiled, twisted feline characters. We have a yak being attacked by a griffin, a mythical beast. And here we have a horse being attacked by, I think it's a lion, but it's got these weird curly horns and wings. So these plaques are not only, again, truths of life on the steppes, but they also show sort of a spiritual power as well. And I use these particular plaques in my novel as rewards for skill and bravery in battle. Now, the hardest thing for me in writing this book, which is about warfare and it is about death, it was writing the battle scenes. I am not a particularly violent person. In fact, the reason I started writing this novel had to do with my struggles with violence, and my dislike of it in the first place. Like I said, my kids were little at the time, and I have two boys. And if you raise little boys, you know that their favorite things to do is to hit each other over the head and punch each other and wrestle. And my kids, for a fairly long period of time, at least one of them thought he was a knight in shining armor, and there were a lot of Nerf swords in my house. And my neighbors would often hear us yelling in the backyard, "No headshots." So, as you know, they're grown up now. They're lovely, they're gentle, they're kind. There's nothing, bad about them. But at the time, I was freaking out because I wanted my kids to be vegetarians and to meditate and do yoga. And I failed on all of those choices. So instead of trying to curtail their natural impulses, I turned my struggle inward. And I asked myself, well, what would a woman like me fight and die for? And I'm sure you know the answer. All I had to do was look out into the backyard at those crazy little boys, and if anyone had tried to hurt them, that would have been the end. So, with that impulse, Akmaral is a deeply spiritual novel. At one point, she comes across these tall stone stelae. They're in these particular ones are found in Mongolia. They are found throughout the steppes and in southern Siberia. And she says that they were left by someone ancient, older than ourselves. These deer stones actually are thought to belong to an even more ancient culture, a Bronze Age ancestor of the characters in my book. And they are also apparently related to the reindeer herders who still travel with their herds in the far north of Siberia. And you see the similarity in the design with the deer amulet. And here's another bronze finial that is in the deer shape. A little more realistic, that one. So, Akmaral is not a story about power-hungry, bloodthirsty warrior woman who wants to control the world. She never seeks out power. She does not want violence. All she wants, like myself looking at my little children, all she wants is to protect her people, her family. And at the beginning of the book, it's just 6 families traveling together with their herds. So it's not impossible to imagine that kind of intimacy and protectiveness. And throughout the course of the novel, of course, the group transforms. Unlike so many historical fiction novels with women as central characters, Akmaral is not an outlier in her culture. She's not fighting against the grain to grab her power or strength. This is an unusual time in history where, in fact, women were expected by necessity to participate in warfare, hold their own in battle, and to lead. So I'm just going to end by reading a short passage from the beginning of the book that hopefully gives you a sense of the kind of seriousness and challenge of this life and how Akmaral views what she does in her world. A black stork drifts onto an isle in the middle of a great shallow lake that stretches for miles, a shimmering mirage. The water in some places rises only to the great bird's ankles. It nips at the fishes, swallowing them by lifting up its beak and choking them back whole. Some say I am like that, stately yet savage, as easy to call for blood as for silence, as longing for the warmth of a lover's chest as to shove it off at the call to arms. But I do not like battle. Only know that a show of strength is required to keep the peace. Blood is strength, which often forms still pools on the battlefield, like this lake or others that are formed by sudden rains. When the sun rises, it dries into the soil and cannot be seen. Blood, passing into memory. I too am passing into memory, I am dying, and will lie soon within the earth and be forgotten. For most of us, it does not last long, this life. A warrior's death always comes early. Yet mine has lasted long enough, longer than I would have thought. I should be proud of what I've done, of defending my people, of guiding them such a great distance from where we had begun. They call us Sauromatae, the Greeks do, and the Scythians also, lizard breasts for our glittering armor scales. But I remember a time when our people had no name, when we were a disparate multitude of wandering herders, a thousand isolated clans clustered into petty camps, our wind-rattled yurts scattered like dung clots across the undulating steppes. Half our horses then were wild, raising dust into dry showers, our sheep, goats, and camels tirelessly gnawing at the tall, sharp grass, turning the hapless earth from emerald to amber to ashen. Out of this I made a nation, though it was nothing I ever sought, never my intent, nothing I would have chosen. This throng that surrounds me now they call a confederacy, and of its greatness they name me leader. This, my legacy, that will linger long beyond my death, exalting all the mighty strife that I abhor. For most of my life I have served the war god Targetai. In his duty I have worn the pelts of wolves and leopards, and hung the horns of wild boars upon my belt. Many other beasts I have hunted roaming across these grasslands, and I have led my people into battle, and I have regretted it. What I did was as anyone would do to protect her people, her family, her children. I have tried to make amends for the damage I have done. If they call me queen, it is little honor for my sorrows. My people gather around me, singing chants and ringing small bronze bells. Huana, they call me, mother of our tribe. But I have been a mother only once, and not for very long. Most of them do not recall. This has been my journey, and I will leave it now or very soon. Though these last breaths before death are anything but sweet, perhaps no one is proud on the day of their death. All are filled with question and doubt, as am I, as I have been almost from the beginning. So I'm going to just leave you with a little bit of music that I listened to every time I had to write a battle scene. It's traditional music from the region, played on a morin cur, a horsehead fiddle. And the dissonance, the drone, the heaviness of this music helped me to prepare to face what Akmaral had to face. Knowing that death was not her choice or her desire, but a necessity to survive, and something she had to conquer in order to lead her people. Okay. I think that's it.
Wow, that was amazing. Oh, yes, Brittany. Wow. Um, okay, so we do have time for Q&A. So if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A, which is a button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Oh my gosh, Judith, though I just have chills from the music and from the like that last reading that you did. It's just beautifully written and so like it's just, I feel like I need to listen to it, like have it an audiobook because it's
Yeah,
just the way you read it was so beautiful. All
thank you.
right, so I have a few questions to get us started and then questions from
Yeah.
our audience.
There
Uh,
is an audiobook, actually. I'm not reading it, but there is one that
Oh yeah, I'll have to go find it.
Yeah,
You should read it though, because you're amazing.
thank you.
Um, so you before we started, you had actually told me a story about how the name Akmaral, how you learned how to pronounce it. And I was wondering if you could share that story because it's so interesting.
Thank you. Yeah, I have to go look for the thing I'm going to tell you about. But for years, I didn't know 100% how to say a lot of the names in my story, a lot of the words in my story. And Akmaral, I always did say Akmaral because it just felt more beautiful to me. But as I started to slowly promote the book as it was coming out last year, I started a hashtag, which is Akmaral. And all of a sudden, people from Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan and Mongolia started writing to me and saying, "What is this book?" Because Akmaral means white deer. And said earlier, the white shamaness was the Akkam. Ak is white, Maral is deer. And not only is it a very popular woman's name in that region, but it has a sort of important spiritual element, which I didn't know. I just found a translation and it said I like that name, so I just used it. And then all these people started writing. This one woman from Kyrgyzstan chatting with me, and she's like, "Well, I have this dance troupe, and I can make a video for you with some of the dancers saying the word Akmaral because I wanted to confirm the right way to say it. So somewhere on my video, on my feed are these lovely, beautiful young women in traditional costumes, and they each come up and they go, Akmaral. So and they're so sweet and she really made a lovely effort and I've heard from a lot of people in the region they're very excited about this book. They're dying to let me get it translated, which I'm working on. So yeah, that's how the name I know it's pronounced correctly with the little in the R.
And I explained I'm terrible with that R sound, so I'm leaving that to you. But that is really wonderful that people in that region embraced it as
Hmm.
opposed to picking at it. So I
I
do
was
want,
worried about that, honestly.
were you
I was, because, it was not my intention at all to do anything but honor this ancient history. And the people who've read it over there, and there have been quite a few, they're like, yeah, you got it. And I'm like, how did I do that? I don't know how I did that. Thank you.
did you have sensitivity readers or just
I just think, I mean, also culturally, it's a different place. And I don't know that they are struggling with the same cultural issues that we are at this time. But I think, first of all, they were excited that anyone in America even knew about this stuff. And that I did really, really, really work hard to be true to the history, the culture. I took a lot of my research for the day-to-day, everyday life from their true, more contemporary lifestyle on the steppes. And I really tried to give it respect. It's not a fantasy. It's not, pretend and there's no dragons in this book. And I wanted to make it like this was a real life as much as I could imagine it. And I think they appreciated the effort. Thank you. I hope they keep doing that.
yeah, I mean they already have, so I can't imagine it'll change. But
Mhm.
what really drew you to this area in this time period? Because you said, you're a writer, you've always been a writer, but there was something about the archaeology of that time and region that really drew you. What was that?
Yeah. I mean, my first novel took place in Greenland, so I clearly like places that until last week nobody had ever heard of. Um, and I love history, particularly women's history in these obscure places and trying to imagine what women's lives were like. And I think I was particularly drawn. I mean, first, just any kind of archaeology story. Even now, I'm like, whoa, there's this cool thing, and I think, do I want to dig deeper into this or that? And so the particular archaeology started my journey. But I also was intrigued by the idea that, at least in this moment, archaeology proves that women were. It was a matriarchal society, that women were equals, that women were leaders. And I wanted to understand that particular experience. And I think now, as women in Western society, no matter how liberated or powerful or important we are, we still have to feel like, well, yeah, but I'm a woman. See what I can do. there's no but in Akmaral's mind.
Mhm.
And I really wanted to work on that idea. And when Timor comes into the story and sort of starts saying, "Well, that's a man's thing," which he does at one point, and I'm like, I just want to slap him. And that's what she's like, "What are you saying?" And she's never heard that before. And I thought that that was a really challenging perspective to try to embrace
Mhm.
as a modern woman living in our time, to imagine what that would be like.
Well, I'm a huge Marvel and comic book fan, and the whole thing about, the Amazons and living in a bubble away from everybody and not
Hmm.
ever having, anybody tell them they can't do something
Hmm.
shows to me that people can do anything if they're
Hmm.
not told they can't.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, so questions from our attendees. Hi, Judith. Wonderful talk. Thanks so much. Was there a particular point of your research that felt unbelievable to you when writing it? One example being that no one ever believes that stirrups hadn't been invented yet.
I know, really. There's so many things we take for granted, like they've always been there.
Hmm.
Um, the there's there is a challenging thing that I decided to include. According to the legends and some of the Herodotus stuff, the Scythians apparently took the skulls of their dead warrior enemies and used them as drinking cups. It's so gross. And there's a lot of debate, and there haven't been any specific discoveries that confirmed it. And I was like, do I keep it in? Do I? And I decided to keep it in because it's horrific, but it's also sort of a point of pride for Timor. And I don't want to tell too much because that's a kind of important part of the story. It's a point of pride for Timor and in a point of contention with Akmaral and his relationship. And theirs is a love relationship, but it's a very complicated kind of love because of the positions and the cultural conflicts and the male-female stuff and it's not it's romantic at moments, but it's not a straightforward kind of situation. So I use that unbelievable artifact, and at one point it is passed from hand to hand. I won't say from whose to whose.
Thanks.
Mm. Gross.
It's fine. I mean, people are gross sometimes, you know?
Yeah. It's a funny thing. My mom's on this call and she'll tell you I was terrified of skeletons when I was little. I was absolutely scared. We had the encyclopedia behind where I had to practice piano as a little girl, and I made her hide the S volume because there was a picture of a skeleton. I was sure it was going to jump out at me.
Oh.
So now I write about archaeology.
You do
Hmm.
skeletons, the bow-legged skeletons. I like those.
Yeah.
Um, Grace asks, how many years of research did this story require for you?
Oh, well, years and years. I never start a book without probably 6 months of solid research. And partly because I have to see if there's even a story.
Mhm.
And I get the story out of the artifacts. I don't make up the story and then kind of find bits and pieces. But even after that, honestly, it took even longer to get the book published than it took to write the book. But I started this book in like 2008, right in the middle of, and I've been on and off researching it up until it was finally published, making sure I was on top of the research. So along the way, I added more and changed more, and I've been very blessed. I have a friend who works at the Smithsonian, and his research seems to keep on following me. He was doing stuff in the Arctic, and then he was doing stuff. He just published a book about the deer stones, those stone stelae,
Mhm.
and it came out about a year before Akmaral was published. And I was like, oh God, I have to get your book and I have to read it. And I was like, can you read my manuscript? And he did. And he was like very complimentary. And he's like, the one thing you don't do right is that they actually came from the East instead of the West, because I was using the Amazon thing. And I said, oh no, because I hint that the Bronze Age people are also part of. And so we had this whole crazy discussion. And the book was already in, pre-publication. There wasn't like going to be a big change. So I'm still researching. Honestly, I get things every day about new Scythian discoveries and things like that.
That's fascinating because you think history is history. It's not immutable. It's not going
Yeah.
to change. But yet the information we gather does change or does
It, yeah.
we
And
find.
our understanding of it, like the idea that the is it golden man was a man is so very much part of the time that it was discovered. And who knows what we're going to find out in 10 years or 2 years? I mean, they could be digging something up now that's going to totally turn our understanding upside down, which kind of invalidates historical fiction, but I'd rather know the truth than write a new book.
Yeah, absolutely. Part two.
Hmm.
Diana asks, what drew you specifically to the steps?
I think the idea of vast emptiness is terrifying and exhilarating all at the same time. The picture of the Altai is in the mountains, but the steppes are the plains. It's the Great Plains of Central Asia. And they go on and on and on for thousands of miles. And unfortunately, I have not had the opportunity to physically go there, although I did go to Greenland for my first book, but the steppes is a whole different thing. And so what I would do is I'd open up Google Earth and I'd take my little thing and I'd literally stand on mountains on Google Earth and I'd turn around or I'd open up the steps and I would be like in the middle of this vast emptiness. And it's daunting. A lot of my writing is about things that I'm scared of.
Mm,
And I'm scared of warfare. I don't want to kill anyone.
mm,
So I write a whole book about it. Um, I like to challenge myself through my fiction to be in places that I cannot survive.
mhm.
And so I think that was part of the attraction of the steps. They're also quite beautiful.
So you've said a couple times, and I'm going to get to Kathy's question in a second,
Hmm.
um, that your book is about warfare. But from that last reading you did, it sounded neat to me like the consequences of warfare,
Hmm.
the perception of it, the not wanting it, the what you would do to be at war. It seems like it's so much deeper than that. It's
It
just so much
is.
more thinking around what it is about.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. It's really about what we're willing to do to protect the ones we love. It's really about motherhood.
Mhm.
Yeah, at its root, it's about motherhood. And in many ways, Akmaral is a mother to her people.
Mhm.
And that whole stuff about I was a mother only once, I'm not going to tell you anything about that, but it's about that transference of the power and the animalistic need to protect your child,
Mhm.
which is biological and at least my experience, very, very, very real.
Mhm.
And then extending it to the greater community and then extending it to a community that you cannot know. And why don't we feel this need to protect all, as far as we can extend that? And that's really a deep pondering underneath a lot of what happens in the novel.
I think we're all thinking about those kind of questions right now. Kathy says, your writing is so beautiful. How did you figure out how to craft a language so it sounds authentic to the era?
Oh, Kathy, that's a good question. I really work my sentences. I'm noticing it now as I'm working on something new. I don't want my language to sound contemporary, nor do I want it to be so ridiculously obscure that no one understands it, which did actually happen with my first novel. There was a draft there with I read it and I was like, I don't even know what I'm saying. What am I saying? But I really look at syntax and word choice and rhythm and I say my words aloud. So part of the reason, I mean, I also was an actor a long time ago, so I read that way. But I read my work out loud. And if the rhythms don't sound right, I go back into them. It's part of the reason it takes me forever to write a novel. I have to find a more efficient way to do this. But I really believe that the language is as important in creating the atmosphere and the emotion as the story itself.
Mhm. I completely agree with that because when you read really great language in a book, you feel like you're there, you're at that setting.
Hmm.
It becomes a character of itself.
Hmm.
So,
Yeah.
um, one last question. You just said what I'm working on next. What are you working on next?
Oh God. Oh God. So it's been a very long journey between whenever I started this in 2008, and I have written several different things in between, many of which have not found, a home in the publishing world. So right now I'm trying something very different, somewhat influenced by one of my students who's like in her 20s, and she writes these weird experimental things that are all kind of, so I'm writing this weird thing that is non-linear, and it takes place in the very, very near future.
Mhm.
But it's about what why does art matter in the middle of climate disaster?
Ooh.
And I don't know if it's any good, but I'm okay with that. Like as a teacher, because I also teach creative writing, you you need to follow the conversation and this that's in your head and discover what it is that the muse or whoever it is wants to say.
Mhm.
And I'm really enjoying the process of discovering a new way that I can write.
Mhm.
And hopefully it's good. And if it's not, I have this other book, but I'm not going to tell you about that because it's sitting in the corner of my desk and I don't want to say anything till I know if it's a real thing. So that's what I'm working on. It's called Impermanence.
Impermanent. Okay, we will
So
keep a lookout for that because Akmaral was wonderful and we learned from it and we thought about it. Or if you haven't read it yet, you should. So I'm sure anything you write is something that's going to make us think, which is important for
thank you.
everybody.
That's really, I appreciate that. I like reading that makes me think too.
Great. Well, thank you so much for being here with us tonight, Judith. And please, if your mom's still here, thank you for pointing this out to me because this has been wonderful. I really appreciate your time and the book and your insight.
Thank you so much, everybody who's on the call and the Ashland Library and Mina. And thank you, Mom. I love you. I'll talk to you later.
Well, happy reading, everybody. I hope you have a wonderful evening.